Welcome to this event. As I've heard being used multiple times in these kind of events, all protocols observed. I apologise for not going through the full list, but we're very happy to have the Ambassador of Morocco, as the Ambassador of the European Union to Ethiopia and the African Union here with us today. The discussion today is really about AfCFTA, but I want to start just a little bit by introducing myself and the project that this is part of. So my name is Bruce Byers. I work at ECDPM, which is the European Centre for Development Policy Management, working in a joint project under the European Union delegation here in Addis, with the Policy Centre for the New South based in Rabat in Morocco, and with ACET, the African Centre for Economic Transformation. So this sort of group of African European think tanks, we're trying to look at various issues that have an impact on Europe-Africa relations. The title of the overall project was about finding a balanced narrative between African and European objectives, but also something of a reality check. So in a way, what underpins the discussion and what we hope to do today around these AfCFTA issues, and particularly the private sector, is to talk about sort of how to ensure that the AfCFTA can be inclusive in order to reach the many goals that have been set, but also how EU and other external partner support can also help reach those objectives. So the topic for today is private sector engagement, SME inclusivity, which we'll kind of deal with in a first set of questions with the panel, which we have a mixture in the room and online. And then we'll move to sort of the broader question to do with regional value chain, which is one of the big ambitions underneath the AfCFTA. But before we get into the discussions, we have three distinguished guests who will sort of offer some opening remarks, which will hopefully stimulate some of the discussion which comes afterwards as well. So we have Her Excellency, Madame Alawine Hamdi, Ambassador of Morocco. If you'd like to take the floor. And I should say as well that we're doing this in English. Unfortunately, we don't have direct translation, but you're welcome to make comments or questions in French when we come to that.
C'est bon? Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam ala ashraf al-mursalin. Your Excellencies and dear colleagues, ambassadors, esteemed ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. It is with a great pleasure for me to be among the list of speakers of this important roundtable dedicated to a subject of crucial importance, especially to African countries. And I would like to seize this opportunity to thank the think tanks coming together yesterday and today for this initiative, which reflects the strong commitment of our respective civil societies in Africa to contribute to the African agenda and priorities. Among these think tanks, I also welcome the Moroccan think tank, the Policy Center of the New South, to which I have the privilege to belong as a senior fellow. Adopted at the AU Assembly of Heads of States and Government in January 2012, the architecture roadmap for accelerating the creation of an African continental free trade area constituted the first milestones in the implementation of one of Agenda 2063's flagship projects, namely a common continental market. The agreement establishing this zone was adopted at the 10th extraordinary session of the Assembly of Heads of States and Government of the African Union, held in Kigali, Rwanda, in March 21st, 2018, and came into force in March 30, 2019. Based on the idea that the AfCFTA is a vehicle for development and integration aimed at achieving the objective of the 1991 Abuja Treaty on regional economic integration, the launch of the free trade zone would open up a market of 1.2 billion consumers and increase the intra-African trade by eliminating tariff and non-tariff barriers in Africa. We combine domestic products of about $3.4 trillion. The AfCFTA, Great Continental Economic Process, is an important continental project which will enable the creation of a large number of job opportunities for the benefit of young people and save 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty and improve the income of 68 million people while increasing continental wealth by $450 billion. In this regard, progress has been made in implementing the AfCFTA, both politically and technically. Following ratification of the agreement by member states, negotiations were launched on trade in goods and services, capital flows and mobility of individuals, as well as on the legal instrument underpinning them. Regarding the private sector contribution and engagement, it is worth mentioning that the AfCFTA private sector strategy aims at delivering impact through engaging with stakeholders from across the private and public sector and from across all corners of the continent to ensure an inclusive approach of implementing the AfCFTA. For the continent to reduce its vulnerability to external shocks and improve trade and economic performance, the AfCFTA regional value chains are being developed under the private sector engagement strategy to offer African countries an opportunity to use regional advantages to boost competitiveness, diversify product supply, and export products with higher value addition. The strategy focuses on 4 national priority sectors of value chains, namely agro-processing, automotive, pharmaceutical, and transportation and logistics, based on the potential for import substitution and existing production capabilities on the continent. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, during the exceptional summit of head of states and government of the African Union in Kigali on the continental free trade area, His Majesty King Mohammed VI, may God assist him, has said, and I quote, "The establishment of a free trade zone at the continental level would contribute to mobilizing energies, developing expertise, and stimulating creative thinking, and responding in particular to the real ambition of our youth to build a strong and integrated African continent." In line with the spirit of cooperation, solidarity, and synergy that is at the heart of the doctrine of cooperation between the Kingdom of Morocco and its African brothers, Morocco is working on investing in order to enhance continental food security by accompanying a group of African countries in building advanced agriculture strategies to strengthen food sovereignty, enhance the ability to compete in international agriculture, and get the access to new markets. The processes of Morocco was one of the first countries to sign the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. Our country ratified it on April 19, 2022. Indeed, the Kingdom of Morocco's commitment to full operationalization of the ZLECAf is part of a new paradigm of multidimensional cooperation based on a win-win approaches, reflecting the desire to pool resources and potential to build a better common future. At the initiative of the General Confederation of Moroccan Entreprises, CGEM, a structured and regular dialogue of African employers has been set up to further strengthen knowledge, cooperation, and trust between African private sectors and to improve public-private dialogue as a key element in the implementation of the Free Trade Area of Africa, FTAA. By carrying out large-scale actions in terms of investments in key sectors of the African economy, finance, telecommunication, basic infrastructure, and so on, implementing socio-economic development projects and sharing its successful experience in a number of structuring fields, our country is contributing to the establishment of all the conditions conducive to the success of full implementation of the FTAA. In this respect, the following should be noted. As part of its commitment to the first phase of negotiations, Morocco has submitted revised tariff concession offers, taking into account the AfCFTA Secretariat comments on the initial offers. These revised offers are in the process of being approved. On the issue of dispute settlement, Morocco has been submitted 2 nominations for the indicative list and one of the 2 remaining seats on the DSB appellate body. With regard to the second phase of negotiations, following the adoption by the February 2022 conference of the 3 protocols on competition, intellectual property, investment, Morocco is on course for ratification of these 3 instruments. With regard to the third phase of negotiations, a revised version of the protocol on digital trade was submitted to Morocco for comments. Morocco has participated in all meetings of the AfCFTA Committee on Digital Trade. The strong political commitment to the FTAA has resulted in significant achievements, but many challenges and constraints must be taken into account and resolved to speed up its operationalization. And these challenges include, first and foremost, convergence. As the key to successful implementation of the free trade zone will require major internal adjustment for the least developed country and for the regional economic communities whose level of integration is still deemed insufficient. This in order to reduce the gaps between member states in terms of development and between regional communities in terms of economic integration. Secondly, the levels of complementarity between African countries remain relatively low, given their productive fabric and the bulk of their foreign trade is with the rest of the world. The success of the FTAA requires a transformation of the economic structures of African countries, which is not obvious, to ensure horizontal complementarity between them instead of the vertical complementarity they have so far with industrialized countries. As far as compensation is concerned, the logic of integration necessarily implies that there will be winners, but also those who will face challenges in its implementation. Operationalization requires the establishment of solidarity mechanisms and the mobilization of appropriate funding to support and accompany economies that will suffer from liberalization at first sight. Therefore, and according to an ambitious methodology, Morocco has worked to contribute to build a continental model of common development through a set of integrating projects and programs in a large number of countries of the continent concerned with the development of infrastructure, university, education, and vocational training, enhancing food and energy sovereignty, health security, valorizing internal resources, and strengthening industrial systems. The Kingdom is also working to exchange experiences and best practices related to economic and development programs, alongside the strengthening of the financial and banking systems of a large number of the continent countries. This enabled the increase in the total value of Morocco's bilateral trade with African countries by 9.5% as an annual average. Morocco is also working through the Sharifian Office of Phosphate, namely OCP, to develop an advanced continental value chain that will enable Africa within years to have fair and equitable access to sufficient quantities of fertilizers by adopting a clear vision to implement projects that will change the agricultural appearance of the continent and enhance its food security and sovereignty. To exemplify for this, the most prominent of which is the work to establish an industrial platform for the production of fertilizers in Ethiopia, our host country, at a cost of $3.7 billion and with a production capacity of about 2.5 million tons annually of fertilizers for the local and export markets, in addition to opening a factory in Ghana, which will be dedicated to the manufacture of fertilizers, and a second factory in Nigeria, which will be dedicated to the manufacture and ammonia used in agricultural fertilization. On the energy level, Morocco and the Federal Republic of Nigeria are working as well on the completion of a gas pipeline between the two countries, that passes through a group of countries in the west of the continent. It is a very ambitious initiative to value the capabilities of our African resources, reshape the regional energy map, enhance the logistical and competitive capabilities of African gas, and strengthen its position in the European market. To conclude, I will stress on the fact that all these initiatives are an expression of the faith of the Kingdom of Morocco in the principles of South-South cooperation, solidarity, and synergy between the countries of the African continent. It is not a new temporary option or is a link to a specific file. Rather, it is a reference doctrine in Moroccan diplomacy since independence. I wish our debate and panels successful discussions, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Many thanks, Your Excellency. This is a nice way to start, I think, providing some of the history behind what we're looking at in terms of the AfCFTA, underlining some of the strategic sectors which have already been selected. And I like the mention of public-private dialogue, creative thinking, looking for win-wins. And it was very interesting to hear your point also about what's happening on the Moroccan side in terms of already beginning to work towards regional value chains. One of the things I think which sticks which sticks with me from your intervention is this idea of new economic structures. And I think that's one of the ones which hopefully will come back also in our discussion. But before we go there, I'd like also to invite the ambassador from the EU, Roland Cobiot, for some introductory remarks from the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a very good afternoon to all of you. But let me, because this is an event that is co-hosted between the Kingdom of Morocco and the European Union, so let me maybe vous dire bonjour en français. Ça aurait pu être la langue qu'on utilise aujourd'hui. Je sais que beaucoup d'entre vous sont ou francophones, ou francophiles, ou très bons francophones. Donc voilà, ça a été décidé comme ça. Mais on aurait pu le faire en français. Voilà, je tenais à le dire. J'en profite aussi pour remercier l'ambassadeur du Maroc, j'allais le dire en anglais, du Maroc, son Excellence Madame Neza, pour être l'excellente co-host, comme on dit en bon français, de cet événement. Je voudrais aussi féliciter toutes les think tanks qui sont ici, de nouveau un terme anglais, notamment, et je voudrais les citer parce que ce sont d'importantes institutions, le Polity Center for the New South, basé à Rabat, l'African Center for Economic Transformation, l'Institute for Security Studies et le Center for Africa-Europe Relations. Je suis sûr que tous ces noms existent aussi en français. Voilà, so now I have to revert to the original language of the few things I wanted to say. The first thing I really wanted to say today is that this event takes place also within a wider framework of another very important event. And this is the start of the campaign on gender-based violence, which is starting tomorrow, hence this orange tie. And even my car today is orange. And I'm saying this not only because this is the campaign, but also because women are important for trade. And we tend to forget that too often. And I think women face a particular condition of having it a much more difficult time in order to contribute to trade, not only in Africa, but around the world. And certainly still in our societies in Europe, this is the place I know best. So I wanted to stress this importance of and make a link between the two events, because all figures show that there is a very wide scope of improvement to integrate women much more in trade, in economy. And if this was the case, I think many countries would be better off. Now, I will make a few remarks, giving you a little bit the European Union angle. But first recognizing that the African Continental Free Trade Area could really be a game changer for Africa. This is not any initiative. This is an incredibly important initiative that dates back for a few years, but that should certainly be continued and accelerated. We have today, I read here, 54 states that have actually signed it and 47, I think, that have ratified it. I hope this is only the beginning of the ratifications and that the next ones will come very quickly. I think it started in 2015, if my memory serves me well. So I think it's the right time to finish the process and start the real implementation of this, because besides the importance of this initiative for trade, for Africa, I think it is also a political project. It's not only an economic and trade project, it is clearly a political initiative that requires political will. Maybe more than a number of other countries or regions in the world, the EU can share, not models, everybody will have its own model, but experience on what we did well and what we did not well, so to avoid repeating the same mistakes. And as you all know, the EU started its journey where we are today with that, with the economy, with trade. Started, in the 50s with coal and steel, and then evolved over the years, and here we are today. So we started as what looked like for many, but it wasn't, what looked like an economic, a trade project, something oriented to sectors, economic sectors, but we all know that this was just the method. It was not the objective. And the objective was to create something that was a unity of purpose, a unity between the people of Europe. And of course, the AfCFTA can be that also for Africa, if you follow a little bit what was done in the EU and what it has created in the EU and why it worked, starting with two sectors at the time and evolving, is that it created solidarities. And this is what Africa needs, is to create solidarities, it's to create interdependence through trade, through the economy, is to bring people together in acknowledging that their faith, that their destiny is actually linked. And this is what happened in the EU. I'm not saying it worked perfectly. We are work in progress, as I always say. The EU will, I think, never be finished. It will never be a completed work. But so far, it has brought a level of integration, a level of interdependence that has brought a number of positive results. Not as much as we would have all wanted, because there are still disparities, there are still problems, but still it has brought quite a lot of positive effects. So the sectoral approach, I think, is interesting. I don't know how Africans will do it in the AfCFTA, but that will be your choice. The other dimension that I wanted to mention is that in these kind of major initiatives, so this is not a small project, this is a major paradigm shifting initiative. There is usually no big bang. It's more a Darwinian theory of evolution. It goes incrementally. You try to build something step by step. You don't decide that from one day to the other, you move from a non-customs union or a non-CFTA into a CFTA. Things usually go gradually. And this is what has happened in the EU. We have moved gradually. It has taken many years. It has taken decades. It's still in the making. We still make errors. We still have shortcomings. It's still difficult. But it can be achieved. I think if we did it, anybody can do it anywhere else. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's possible. So today we are reaping the fruits of this, customs union, of this free trade area with a common border for goods. And of course, we are at the time when we started much less than Africa. We started with 6. We are today 27. Africa has twofold that number of 27. So it will be probably more complicated, but again, I think with the political will that is necessary, with the acknowledgement and the awareness that this will bring benefits to countries, to regions, to the whole continent, and notably, I want to insist, to the populations, this is something that is worth the work. So from the experience, we have a card in the process of economic integration. The EU believes that it can be, I'm reading here, the best. I don't know if we can be the best, but we can be a good partner of Africa to try to look into the ways, the nuts and bolts, the methods, the pace, the sequence on how this AfCFTA could actually develop. We are there to share experiences, again, not models. I think there are no models in this world. They are just sources of inspiration. But it is a source of inspiration because we have achieved something that, again, is imperfect, but that can, guide the action of others into avoiding making some of the wrongdoings we have done, but maybe also to achieve a number of results. One particular project I wanted to mention of our support in this, which is already existing, is the Technical Assistance Facility for the AfCFTA and the Continental Economic Integration. I read that we have an amount of 30 million. Great, probably not enough. I think we can go beyond that. In addition, what we are trying to support is the emergence of selected key regional values chains that the Ambassador of Morocco has already mentioned in Africa, notably agri-food, tourism, the automotive ecosystem, and so on and so forth. Of course, all this in close partnership with the African Union Commission and the International Trade Center. Another key area of support is the partnership around sustainable critical raw material value chain, very fashionable. That's what you hear all the time for the time being, to help African countries diversify their economies and create local added value, thereby promoting the investment and taking advantage of all the opportunities of the AfCFTA. The opportunities are there, the challenges are also there, but the potential is huge. Africa trade currently represents 2.3%, maybe this figure can be disputed, but that gives a magnitude. So Africa trade represents 2.3% of global exports. This is too small for the capacity and the potential of Africa and compared to the population of Africa. So it's mainly commodities, natural resources. The intra-African trade flows are at about 14%. If you compare this, of course, we are not at the same level of integration there, but if you compare that to the EU, the intra-EU trade is not 2.3%, it's over 50%, and it was even bigger before COVID. So we at a certain stage reached figures of 60 to 70% of our trade that was intra-European. So when I hear and read sometimes that the EU is dependent on some emerging economies and so on, yes, partly, but the great bulk of our economy is inside the European Union amongst ourselves. And with a fully operational AfCFTA, projections, of course, again, that can all be discussed, but the projections anticipate that in the next 10 years, the intra-African flows with an AfCFTA could raise up to 25%. I don't know if it's 25, 30, or 20, but I think it could be multiplied by many times in terms of the intra-African trade that could be led by this kind of initiative. Another estimation is that this huge internal market would represent an exchange potential of 20 billion euros. It's probably more than that, but again, it gives you an order of magnitude. On the other hand, we all know that the toolboxes, the agreements, all the systems and declarations that we have in here are not sufficient. Again, it is a political project besides being an economic project. And to achieve greater integration, this requires a comprehensive approach. I think the efforts around the Agenda 2063 and the first 10-year implementation moving in now into the next 10-year plan will focus, I hope, notably on this, and again, the EU stands ready to help. Now, just to end, a few more personal thoughts to trigger the discussion. The first one is that we need to work on incentives. The AfCFTA guided trade initiative is an example of this, and it's led by the coalition of those countries that want to go faster. Again, taking a little bit what happened in the EU, just as a term of comparison, we have also, used in certain instances the fact that certain countries want to move faster than others. We call this in our jargon, double speed or concentric circles. I mean, there have been many different ways of addressing this issue. And that's a possibility to look at if this is what the African continent wants. But again, maybe in order to be efficient, to reach the goals, we should not await the perfect situation where everything is ready, where everyone is ready in order to start a process in concrete terms. Sometimes you need to go gradually. But that's just for your reflection. Second, the incentives should go hand in hand with sustainable industrial development and economic diversification. There is no single model. Again, the EU is not a model. For successful industrialization, Africa will have the space, the capacity, the ambition to embark on a path that is its own sustainable way, and that will be decided by the Africans in the African way, and that's the way it should be. Third, Africa needs to be better connected. That is clear. This world is interconnected. Look at us today. We are here in the room, but we are also talking to people, outside with digitalization and so on, something that would not have happened a few years ago. This world is changing, and we need to adapt our mentalities. And very often, unfortunately, human nature and mentalities are progressing much slower than the changes of the world. And we have not been used over centuries, over millennia, to a situation like the one we have today, where our brain needs to adapt to fast changing environments. And this is something we have difficulties as human beings to do. But we should adapt, and today we should certainly be more connected. Trade requires digital connectivity. Even the small-scale farmers, and Africa has been a leader in this, frog leaping in that particular sector, where farmers being away from markets actually now use digital applications and mobile platforms in order to trade. It also requires reliable and sustainable energy supply, notably renewables, and it requires transport connections. Fourth, we need skills, and all the efforts that are made by African countries and that we are trying to help with through education, vocational training, on-the-job and lifelong learning are all issues that are very important. Fifth, African industrial SMEs need to partner with international peers. Competition is with more rooted companies from other regions, and that, of course, sometimes poses a threat and jeopardizes the emerging realities. African SMEs should play smart and ally with key competitors, learning on the job the art of complex international entrepreneurship and competitive global value chains. And in this regard, what I want to say, as I'm a competition lawyer by training, is that competition is a little bit like democracy. We very often say democracy is not the best system, but we haven't found a better one, right? So far, in order to cater for people's aspirations, freedoms, and so on and so forth. It's a little bit the same with competition. Competition is not a perfect system. But I remember a Nobel Prize laureate, Mr. Hicks, who said one day, the great things about monopolies is that it gives them a very quiet life. And it's very true. So competition fosters innovation. It fosters, entrepreneurship. It fosters lower prices. It fosters more consumer access, and so on and so forth. So I think, and it is not the case in all countries in Africa for the time being, where you have a structural environment which is conducive to liberal economies, to more open trade, to more open markets, to more competition. And of course, everybody, I think there are not two liberal systems that are the same, a little bit like democratic systems. You don't have two democratic systems that are exactly identical. But I think it's important to move into that direction if you want to reap the fruits of an AfCFTA. Finally, 6, the raw materials and strategic products should be transformed in Africa as much as it can be, creating a continental and regional value chain that could create, of course, millions and millions of jobs. Lastly, because I want to close the circle on where I started it with women, micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, especially women and youth-owned enterprises, need to have a voice and need to be supported maybe more than others to ensure that you have a more inclusive trade under the AfCFTA. Enhancing women and youth participation in the economy is an imperative in my eyes to achieve a more sustainable and inclusive development. As a conclusion, the EU is trying, imperfectly, yes, but we are full of goodwill to try to help and to be at the forefront of partnering with Africa on all these issues of great importance. We do it today notably through different instruments. One is the Global Gateway that you have all heard about. Another one is the Europe-Africa Investment Package, the support to PRIDA and the Continental Master Plan, and so on and so forth. I'm not here to make promotion. The EU-Africa are also, we have to recognize, natural, geographical, historical, cultural partners. What is more easy than making trade between these two continents? Same timeline, close proximity geographically, very old historical links that goes back centuries and centuries. I see the ambassador of Portugal at the end of the room, and Portugal celebrates today, I mean, not today, but this year, 500 years of relationships with Ethiopia. I don't know if it's Africa or Ethiopia, but so this shows that the link that brings us together is old. We are not Europeans newcomers to the continent. Some other countries are newcomers to this continent. They have been here only a few years. We should not forget that. We have been here for the worst and the best for many years, and I think this cannot be erased. And finally, the African countries and the African regional and continental institutions should be, of course, in the driving seat of this process. But of course, being in the driving seat does not exclude that you have helpful and constructive passengers in the car, and that we can work together in order to achieve results that will be of benefit to Africa, but that can be also mutually beneficial for many. So maybe I will end just as the ambassador of Morocco ended. The South-South is good, but the North-South relationship and cooperation is not dead, and we should keep it alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. So this is sort of added to the initial focus on the AfCFTA and bringing in this additional dimension of sort of thinking about how partnership with external actors can work as a supporter, and with this ambition, as you say, of the Global Gateway to try and help support an African agenda. And even if we talk about critical raw materials, and there are sort of concerns perhaps rising about this as a reversion, in fact, to sort of mineral extraction, as you say, the idea is that find ways to help make this sort of fit with the ambition of regional value chains and employment. And I think that's hopefully what we can talk about today. And as you began with talking about the gender dimension, of course, if we're talking about including SMEs, then very often we're talking about women and women traders, which is very important to bring up as well. And we know that there's the protocol on women and youth is currently being discussed. And perhaps then I'll go to the sort of final introductory remarks. Joining us online, so Dr. Francis Mangeni is representative of His Excellency the Secretary General of the AfCFTA Secretariat. So Mr. Mangeni, Dr. Mangeni, indeed, please, we look forward to hearing your intervention a little bit on progress and where the AfCFTA stands and how you see this topic that we're discussing today on inclusion and private sector engagement. Dr. Mangeni.
Excellency, the Ambassador of Morocco, Excellency, the Ambassador of the European Union, Excellencies, senior officials, the organizers of this event, ECDPM, ASET, ISS and the Moroccan think tank. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. So firstly, please allow me to thank you for extending an invitation to the AfCFTA. I bring you greetings from the Secretary General Wamkele Menye, and to congratulate you on what is panning out to be a potentially transformative event. I believe that this is not the first and the last. Actually, it builds on a few that have happened already, and that there will be many more to continue. I would like to thank the Ambassador of Morocco for her statement. She gave us the state of play and also the role, the leadership role that Morocco is playing on the continent. And she represents the proposition that actually member states are in the driving seat. This is a member state-driven process. I also thank the Ambassador of the European Union for inspiring us, telling us that we can draw lessons from the experience of the European Union and actually laying out a detailed agenda on some priorities that we may wish to look into. I believe this is good orientation for the event and for the discussion that we are going to have today. Now, I would like to touch on three issues. The first one is the importance of this event or the relevance of this event from the perspective of the Secretariat with regard to the private sector and partners. And then secondly, on implementation, as you heard Bruce, our distinguished moderator, say, the status is extremely important for us to be informed about. Of course, the Ambassador of Morocco laid out actually some of the state of play, the elements of the state of play. But what does it mean? What does implementation actually mean? And then lastly, the role of think tanks like ACDPM. What can we expect from them? How can they contribute? And how can they go about it? So these are the three things I'd like to deal with, if you allow me. Now, beginning with the relevance of this event, I think it's a very important event. We actually need more of them, as I have already said. First and foremost, the AfCFTA, though negotiated by governments, is meant for the private sector. And it is in the private sector using the AfCFTA that we can begin to see the benefits we like to talk about all the time. And in this regard, we need to take into account the fact that, of course, SMEs constitute the bulk of the private sector. I think we have numbers like 90% of the private sector is SMEs, not only in Africa, but across the world, actually. Yes. And actually, the bulk then of the SMEs, small-scale traders, are women again. So inclusiveness is extremely important. So this really points to the importance of this event. Secondly, we have got the guided trade initiative, which has happened. And what has it shown? It has shown that the AfCFTA is open for business. You can actually send consignments from country A to country B across the continent using AfCFTA rules, procedures, and documents. So the message here would be to encourage the private sector to use it. Go out, follow up the trade and investment opportunities that are opening up under the AfCFTA. And therefore, events like this are extremely important. I would like to add as well that issues of including the local government are extremely important, because if we talk about the value proposition of the AfCFTA, that we are 1.47 billion people, we've got 60% of the world's unutilized arable land, that we've got 30% of the world's critical minerals. All these value propositions actually reside in the countryside. So local governments become extremely important. If we are going to talk about creating jobs, which of course is a value proposition of the AfCFTA, then we need to know, again, that we need school-based, community-level incubation or innovation centers, which allow ordinary people, youth, women, to transform their skills, their dreams, their passions, even their problems into viable businesses so that they can become national brands, regional brands, continental brands, even global brands. This ultimately is how to address unemployment and how to grow economies, because economies grow at extensive margins through continuously introducing new products, new industries into the economy. Sometimes we call it diversification, though that expression doesn't really capture the importance of the matter. So I believe this event is extremely important and timely, and we can look forward to many more to follow in terms of engaging the private sector, who are the ultimate users and beneficiaries of the AfCFTA, in order to have the impact we talk about it, which must be inclusive. Now, implementation. What does implementation actually mean? It has a number of factors or aspects. The first one is completion of unfinished business. This could be negotiations. Then secondly, domestication, giving the AfCFTA the force of law in the domestic regimes, making the AfCFTA duties and obligations meaningful in that they become actually part of the domestic policies, domestic rules. They are recognized and they can be enforced. That's domestication. And then compliance. This means that now that you have the rules setting out how things should be done, you have the rule. The administrative and regulatory authorities, such as customs, immigration, standards bodies, should on a routine daily basis comply with those rules. So compliance is actually at the heart of the matter. And for this, the private sector actually takes very seriously, and it means a lot to the private sector. And then, of course, utilization. The private sector should be able to utilize the opportunities that open up. If you have the AfCFTA agreement, it remains on the shelves without being utilized, then that's not good at all. So we need to make sure that the AfCFTA is utilized by the private sector. And we know in this regard that things of improving the business environment are extremely important. Market intelligence, knowing the opportunities that are available, are extremely important. So utilization. And then enforcement. Should there be breaches, there should be a way of addressing them, of addressing breaches. There could be breaches by governments putting in place measures that are inconsistent with the AfCFTA agreement, or governments not doing what they are supposed to do. So we need enforcement mechanisms. And thankfully, at the AfCFTA, we have in place a robust enforcement mechanism, which needs to be utilized. Of course, we also have soft enforcement mechanisms, like the system for addressing non-tariff barriers when they come up. So this too needs to be utilized. And it's really inclusive, it's very democratic, it's web-based. Once you have the link, which is tradebarriers.africa, you can access it anywhere, anytime on the continent, provided you're on the internet, and report a complaint, which will be registered across the continent with all the relevant actors who will swing into action and get it addressed. Now, this system was actually cloned or copied from a system that exists in Eastern and Southern Africa, from ESA, ESC, and SADC. We have got there a tripartite online system for addressing non-tariff barriers, and its link is tradebarriers.org. It has been extremely successful. More than 90% of reported NTBs have been eliminated. So we believe this continental system will likewise work very successfully for the private sector and for all of us. And then after enforcement, of course, we need the socio-political processes for building capabilities. Sorry for my cockerel. I got so chicken. Right. So for building capabilities on the continent for making sure the AfCFTA works. So this includes infrastructure, it includes innovation, but it also includes routine capacity building events, such as the workshops or information sharing events, such as the ones we are having right now. And the thunder as well. I think rain is coming. This very telling of the good things to come. Right. So this is what implementation means. Now, regarding outstanding issues, we've done very well on completing negotiations. We've done 92.3% of the rules of origin, 93.2% of tariff lines now have agreed rules of origin. We need to finalize rules of origin for textiles and clothing, and then for automobiles. But I need to quickly add that we already have rules of origin for trading in parts for the automotive sector, both tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So that's good news in that we can start building actually the automotive sector. And the automotive sector is actually well organized. They are very well coordinated. They produce position papers and assist the negotiations. We've got the 3 protocols on competition, investment, intellectual property adopted by the summit at its last meeting. This was rapidly done, and I think we can say that it continues to show the commitment of the member states, the political will, the ownership at the highest political level of the AfCFTA and the process. Then in terms of market access, we've got 42 tariff schedules. I think this is a big number. We only have a few left. For services, we have got 22 that have been adopted, tariff schedules, but there are 26 which are at an advanced stage of finalization. So what this means is that we've got the beginnings or a core or a basis for actually trading on the continent, as indeed the Guided Trade Initiative has shown. We have held 3 editions of the Intra-Africa Trade Fair, one in Cairo, one in Durban, and again back in Cairo. At the event in Durban, we actually raised, we had business deals worth $42 billion in just a space of 1 week. So this shows you that there's actually business to be done. There are projections that actually just next year, there will be $1.8 trillion be made on the continent. Of course, you know, the African economy combined GDP is actually $6.7 trillion at purchasing power parity. And if Africa was a country, this would make it the 4th largest economy in the whole world. Right, and we've got lots of tools which have been put in place in order to facilitate trade on the continent. This includes the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, where we can actually trade using local currencies, and the transaction is completed within 24 hours. So this is very efficient, and it helps us to address some of the huge problems we have of shortages of foreign exchange and of high charges and of delays in actually effecting transactions, right? We have got the e-tariff book and the Africa Trade Observatory, which help you to sit at your laptop or on your phone and then find out trade and investment opportunities, which products have been opened up or liberalized, and in which country. If you're here in Zambia, you want to sell products to Egypt or to Morocco, you simply go to the e-tariff book. It will show you which product lines have been liberalized, what the applicable duties are, and how they will be reduced to 0 over the next 10 years. It will also show you how much demand actually for that product there is in Egypt or Morocco or Ghana. So this is what these tools do. And of course, we have got many, many other tools which we have in place, such as the adjustment facility to assist countries that are experiencing shock revenue shortfalls. This is extremely important. We've got the SME fund, which the Secretariat has actually negotiated and put in place in partnership with Equity Bank and the United Bank of Africa. So we got lots. We are working very hard as Secretariat to provide an enabling environment for the trade to happen under the AfCFTA. And of course, through processes like this, which we encourage very much, we also take the opportunity when invited, and we're always grateful when invited, to share information. Now, lastly, what can we expect from think tanks? And again, I really have to reiterate my gratitude that ECDPM is working very closely with other think tanks, ASET, you know, the National Institute for Security Studies, right, and the Moroccan think tank, and many others, to provide backstopping to the AfCFTA, supporting the private sector, supporting governments, and even supporting the Secretariat. I should mention ODI as well. They were present at the workshop yesterday. I'm sure they are present today as well. So what can we expect of them? We expect a lot from you. We look up to you. Provide evidence to support policy making and to support implementation and to support reviews and continuous improvement of the regimes we have in place. There's a saying that think tanks are the brains of the country. So we can actually say they are the brains of the continent. So this is really how important you are. So this year, 2023, as you know, the African Union theme is accelerating the implementation of the AfCFTA. Next year, 2024, we've got the first 5-year mandatory review of the AfCFTA. According to the timeline set out in the Abuja Treaty, this year, 2023, is a year when we are supposed to embark on the process of building a common African market. If you look at the AfCFTA, it already has a protocol on trading goods, which is actually progressively leading us to free movement of goods. You've got the protocol on trading services, progressively leading us to free movement of services and the persons. We've got the protocol on investment, which deals with free movement of capital and investment. So we have got the AfCFTA as a low-hanging fruit for transitioning into the common market. And of course, according to the Abuja Treaty, we have 5 years up to 2028 to consolidate. So in light of these timelines, the Your Workers think tank is really cut out for you. Methodology is extremely important because the evidence has to be credible. So we expect you to actually pay close attention to this. But in addition to just the routine theory and the methodology, we would like you also to make sure that what you produce is usable. So we look forward to having policy recommendations, to policy implications and recommendations, policy briefs, and to making sure you deal with what is usually said, that politics without policy is blind. It's like having a bull in a china shop. That's if you have politics without policy. But if you have policy without politics, it's empty, because you will have things just written which remain on the shelves, and you don't have the political wherewithal, you don't have the political processes for actually making sure that this works. So this is extremely important. And therefore, in this regard, we would like you to take into account the developmental approach to integration, which, as you know, combines markets. It's not only just neoliberalism, opening up markets, but also industrialization and infrastructure building and macroeconomic stability, as well as political stability. And then, of course, inclusiveness, policy space, flexibility. We would like you to pay attention to existential priorities, because what we do must be relevant to the priorities of the member states, the governments. What keeps them awake at night?
Thank you very much, Dr. Mangeni. I apologize.
All right. So I have actually, yes, I have actually taken a lot of time. The Ambassador of Morocco spoke for only 15 minutes. The Ambassador of the EU spoke for 20 minutes. So I have actually gone into a lot more. So let me stop here and really congratulate you on this event. Back to you, Bruce. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Mangeni. I was worried about time, but in fact, we would like to sit and listen to you for longer, because I think the points that you're making are bringing us closer and closer to what we really want to talk about, which is about the implementation challenges. I think what you said at the end there, to my mind, is very interesting, is this step from policy to practice. We're in between. There's a third P, which is the political step. So yesterday we have one more intervention, and then we'll go to the panel discussion. But yesterday there was a closed door experts event where we discussed the investment protocol, how to turn that from policy to practice, let's say, and also linking to some of the stories today. But what I want to do is just ask George Boateng from ASET, who's online, just to give us. There was 3 key points from each of those 2 sessions. So if you could just briefly give us those, George, then what we can do is pick those up, and we'll put those to our panel discussants who we have here in the room. George, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and thank you, eminent speakers, Your Excellencies in the room, and everyone who's participating both in the room and online. Bonjour and bon après-midi. That is all the French I can I can speak. But thank you very much for for the speeches. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, it's clear. Thank you.
Okay, great. So yesterday we had a very, very interesting discussion. We had experts in the room, and there were two focus areas during these discussions. One of them was how do we move from investment protection to investment promotion? And the other was how do we strengthen the links between what European
I think you need
support
to put your slides in presentation mode, because at the moment we have an overall page. But if you go to the session one and perhaps just go through the 3 bullets there, but you need to put it in presentation mode.
Oh, okay.
But for some reason we see, well, in fact, do you know what? If you leave the slides up, perhaps you can just quickly go through the bullets, and then we'll begin the panel discussion. Off
So
you go. Yeah.
maybe I should share the screen. Do I stop sharing the screen?
No, just carry on and read we can see both your slides. Just be aware we can see both your slides. And therefore you can just go through, but it's not a problem. I think that the main point is if we get the 3 bullets, it will help the conversation.
Okay, I see the problem. So, I mean, perhaps I'll just go through the points quickly.
Yeah.
The first one, we discussed 3 points. The first one was on domestication of the AfCFTA protocols. The second one was how do we cooperate instead of competing for the same investments that are on the table. And the third was how do we tackle the practical problems on the ground. So, I mean, first of all, we looked at basically about what the investment protocol can do. How does it stimulate investment? I mean, what are some of the key issues that are in the investment protocol? We realize that this protocol is quite important for what we want to do. It moves us straight from investment protection and then straight to investment promotion. But one thing I realize is that the investment protocol alone will not stimulate investments. For example, I mean, when you look at other protocols that involve the trade in goods and services, the rules of origin, competition policy, as well as the digital protocol, I mean, they all depend on one another. And if you want to incentivize investments, we need all of them working. We need countries to ratify these protocols and then domesticate them. In the speeches, we had a lot of the SMEs that we all use when we are talking about the AfCFTA and all the good things that it brings. But the key word in all of this is that all these great estimates will not happen if we don't fully implement the agreement, and that is quite important. The agreement needs to be fully implemented to unlock investment opportunities, and countries must be encouraged to ratify and domesticate these protocols. Another driver of the agreement is the AU's free movement of people protocol. We need to revisit that protocol. At the moment, we have only 4 countries who have ratified this agreement. And I mean, on Monday, we were in this forum in Accra, the regional forum on NAFTA in Accra, where the Director of Trade in Goods and Competition Policy at the AfCFTA Secretariat made a very profound statement. He mentioned that after going through the GTI processes for a while, trying to export goods under the GTI, there was one missing link, and that is that he thinks that if we don't address the free movement of people, if we don't address challenges with it, we might not be ready to, or we might not be able to fully implement the protocol. I mean, the AfCFTA agreement in the whole. So it's something that we need to revisit to enhance investment. Also, there was discussions around cooperation and competition. A critical thing that we all know is that if the phase 2 agreement where investment sits can only be driven by cooperation by member states. And I mean, investment coordination will be critical to attract investment. There's always a tendency for countries to compete instead of cooperate for investment. There's nothing wrong with competition, as we heard from the previous speakers, but cooperation might have investment might have a larger, effect. When we look at, for instance, the cotton fall in West Africa, they produce a lot of raw materials, raw cotton, but they might not have the superior technology as is in Southern Africa or in East Africa or even in North Africa to add value to this produce. So the question really comes, how do we incentivize intra-African investment so that there can be cooperation in producing high value goods? And also we also discussed the role of the Africa Trade and Investment Agency, which is an important player here. They need to be resourced so that they play their coordinating role by linking up with investment agencies in the regional economic communities and also on the national investment promotion agencies. The third issue that we looked at, a very, very interesting issue, is how do we tackle the practical investment challenges? And beyond domestication and beyond the cooperation that I spoke about, we need to ensure that businesses have a favorable environment to attract investors and also to operate. And when we look at, on the ground, we know that effective trade will require logistics, it will require cross-border infrastructure, it will require, we heard from the speakers that we need well-functioning energy markets as well as air markets. We also need the borders to be managed properly, port efficiency, the financial architecture, and so on and so forth. So, we were fortunate enough to have the Private Sector Summit, Africa Private Sector Summit, share with us the Private Sector Charter, which catalogs a lot of enablers and to improve the business environment. And I would advise everyone to have a look at that charter and pay attention to page 4. You understand.
Thank you, George. I'm going to interrupt you. I realize you still have a second set, but we have them up here in the room, and I'm really just worried about the time. So I'm sorry, I'm going to cut you off.
We can always share this with the participants.
Exactly. So we can share the slides after, but thank you for giving us that overview. But indeed, so the challenge that we discussed yesterday was really sort of this competition versus cooperation around regional value chains. And then thinking about the European side, there is an element of foreign direct investment, but how to ensure that this actually does link to the local economy and the local sort of environment. So again, apologies, George, for cutting you off. But I would really want to get to the panel discussion now, so I'd like to invite our panelists. We have 2 in the room. Winked Mutini, who's going to come up who's from PASI, from the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I would also like to invite Professor Jaidi from the Policy Centre for the New South. So Dr. Mangeni, the Moroccan think tank is called the Policy Centre for the New South. And by the way, at the entrance, you can see there are some publications from the Policy Centre for the New South. You can feel free to take those. At the same time, online, we have Dirk Willem de Velde, who is from ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, who has his camera on. And we'd also like to ask Stephen Karangizi if you'd be willing to put your camera on too. Now, the theme for today then has been sort of, we've managed to go from the very broad discussions about the AfCFTA, discussion about the need for it to be used to promote employment, for it to be inclusive. And we wanted to just touch on some initial questions on how do we actually go about this idea of including and empowering the private sector. So I was interested from the PASI point of view, so the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. You're working with chambers in sort of numerous countries around Africa, 30, I think, of a potential population of 54. From your perspective, and if we talk about the AfCFTA, what are some of the challenges that you hear from SMEs? To what degree is there a demand? I mean, I like to think so often that there's a policy supply, so in a way that's what we've been listening to up till now. And as Dr. Mangeni said, it needs to be used. There needs to be a policy demand from the private sector. So in your experience, what are the kind of challenges perhaps that SMEs are facing, and how much interest and demand do you hear from the SME side for the AfCFTA?
So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Yes, we're in the same room. Yes, we're here to discuss. I know we've been listening quite a bit, but I think it's just a good set point. So I represent the Pan African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. As he's presented briefly, we represent all the national chambers. And our work is to see how do we evolve chambers of commerce? Because if you think about it, the access point for most information or even engagement to the private sector is through chambers and association. But the missing link that we tend to have is the information gap. That is the one thing that you'll hear consistently happening. If you walk out here and go to a couple of businesses along the line of Kazanchis and just ask, do you know what the AfCFTA is? How many will mention back they've heard about it? So a big gap is missing, and if you want them to be a player, they have to understand first what they are expected to play into the whole AfCFTA implementation. So one thing that also came up was the media engagement. If the media platform was used, most people are watching their TV, they're listening to their radios. If you look again at the disbursement, not putting the image of just between or being within an urban setting, but looking at where businesses are, which is outside of urban settings. How do you get to them? Yes, you could say social media and the likes, but that is also going to limit their access to that information. So there needs to be a very clear, simplified information around what the AfCFTA is, the opportunity it presents, and what are the markets that are ready for their products? Because that's another question we tend to receive a lot. Someone will come and say, I have oil seeds and I want to find a market in Africa. Where do I go? Who do I go to? Who's going to support me? In case of issues, how is the resolution going to happen? So on our part as the chambers, we looked at 5 key pillars to be able to support on this. So the first one, of course, is about boosting inter-Africa trade. So that is giving information, getting to know about the different chambers and how they're supporting both public-private policies. And then the other bit is on improving the productive capacity of businesses. Because if you want the businesses to trade, if I need to rely on products coming from Kenya going to South Africa, they need to know that that product meets a particular quality standard and also that there is a way that they can get the fulfillment of those products. Then the other bit is on gender responsive entrepreneurial environment. How do we also create, I mean, the whole topic every time we hear is women are the ones who are running most of the economy, but how do we create the gender responsive environment? So we worked on a certain program called the Gender Equality Seal that is targeting associations as well as the private sector, and also there's another tool being developed for the public sector. So that this way, even when you're talking about gender responsive, policies, you already have both public-private understanding. What are those dimensions when you're talking about? This is on pay, access to trainings. When do you even do those trainings? If you do the training on a Saturday evening and she has to go to a family, it doesn't equate to access to that information. Then we have on greening initiatives for business. We're talking about leapfrogging and we're talking about technology, right? How do we get our businesses already thinking beyond just looking at the easy access to plastic, but looking at how do they also get, what do you call it? Like you have materials that can be able to use that are disposable and recyclable. So there's also a big issue on packaging. That's another thing that you'd hear a lot of SMEs bring up. And lastly, we look at the Chamber Africa Connect. Now the Chambers of Commerce, again, have a lot of information. They have an idea about the sectors. They talk directly to the businesses. That's how we get our information about SMEs. So if they can share their information among each other and create a platform where we can now look at if it's about policies that are being brought up nationally, regionally, or even on continental level, then it's easier to advocate because now you have concrete information from the representatives that you have. So this is how we sort of span our engagement to.
So in a way, PASI is already sort of playing this role of sharing information and through the chambers getting some sort of come and going. But what I was interested in also is just, is it a distinction with the AfCFTA particularly that either offers new opportunities that firms are looking for vis-a-vis just normal trade? I mean, I guess the point is that what you're mentioning is for SMEs to trade in general may be a challenge. So is there anything specific on the AfCFTA where you think there could be opportunities which don't exist already or where you've heard sort of an interest from firms?
There is interest because now everybody is looking at a whole market. Before you'd think about how do I move my goods, let's say you're from East Africa trying to get them to West Africa, you start thinking about all the blocks for you to get your products. The vision that is being sold by the AfCFTA is that now you should be able to access these markets with the rightful support. But the issue of back again to information is what's lacking. So every time they come back, they say, okay, so where do I go? Where's my entry point? Who's going to support me in that market? So there is interest in the AfCFTA. It does produce, or rather it does present a couple of interesting opportunities. If you look at tourism, if you did a whole regional tourism package, right? You have an airline, you have the transport companies, you have the visas agreed upon, and then even come up with different restaurants that you make it that you go around tasting the cuisines of the region. That already positions multi-sectors involved in it. So that's how the AfCFTA in a sense.
Okay, no, but it's interesting, and it shows that there is some dynamism, but there's also some work still to be done, let's say. But that links then to the questions I wanted to put to Stephen Kanangizi, if he's online, and if you'd like to put your camera on, Stephen. So Stephen Kanangizi, for those who don't know, is the former director and CEO of African Legal Support Facility, and was also formerly Deputy Secretary General at COMESA. So I think for Stephen, we can use sort of what was just discussed just now. I think it would be interesting to know sort of recent work that you've been doing, looking at the regional free trade agreements and trying to sort of draw lessons for the AfCFTA. Are there some sort of key lessons that you can pick up already from what happens with SMEs at the regional level, at the REC level with the COMESAs and the other RECs that we think we could be drawing on for the AfCFTA?
No, thank you very much, moderator, and good afternoon to everybody. I think the speaker from the Chamber of Commerce has really emphasized the key issue that we've identified in the study, which is an information gap. Our study focused on what exists under the RECs, what you would call the RECs acquis, because the AfCFTA provides that they will ride on to the RECs acquis, that is the policies and best practices that are in place. Interestingly, there are quite a number of best practices that are in place intended to encourage SME participation in trade across the region. Some of them for the smaller enterprises is like the STR that is simplified trade regime, but very minute. So I think that's not much as what we are talking here, although it would stimulate understanding of trade opportunities across borders. For the slightly larger, like the medium enterprises, I think their biggest opportunities come under the rules of origin. So our study showed that there is still some differences between the rules of origin of the regional economic communities and the AfCFTA. Of course, there is a big opportunity that all of them emphasize the need for targeting value chains. So they are intended to provide for regional accumulation so that you have value chains. But we then also interviewed the countries themselves. We interviewed 5 countries or participants the policymakers and private sector in 5 countries. What is obvious is that information gap and also some other challenges that the private sector faces. Maybe I can come back to that later, but the main point is that the RECs have put in place policies already that can enable SME regional accumulation in order to take advantage of the regional value chains, but there is a gap in terms of transforming that to real trade.
Okay, no, but that's, one of the questions, I guess, is also the degree to which firms are really looking beyond their existing REC. So we did work previously looking in Mozambique, where the majority of trade is with SADC countries, or the majority of intra-Africa trade is within SADC countries. So there's a very small number of firms actually looking beyond SADC. And in some respects, the AfCFTA is offering this much wider market. But I wonder, at the small scale level, I'm thinking of COMESA, which is already a large market with 20 countries, are there SMEs who are already sort of looking to try and go beyond COMESA, or who already see sort of a new opportunity that somehow wasn't available under COMESA? Is that something which you see, or do you think it's still back to this information and market intelligence type response?
They've started looking at it, and that's part of what we discovered, partly because the policymakers have been carrying out similar discussions as you're having now with the private sector. And I think there was one speaker, I don't remember who, mentioned 2 areas where this is likely to be predominant. That is the the agriculture value chain area. So they're looking at that. And the second one is, of course, the mineral area. So you already have quite a bit of it, for instance, in the mineral area. People don't realize this, that there are quite a number of industries that have been set up to add value in the mineral areas, particularly, for instance, gold, and which are cross-border. But beyond the region, Eastern and Southern Africa, I should say that Eastern and Southern Africa probably has deeper trade because of the long-standing removal of barriers and the liberalization that has taken place over a longer period and putting in place this kind of measures. But they all complain about one thing. Information is lacking, and they really need to get out to be able to take advantage of that. There are other challenges that they face, but I don't need to go into that now. For instance, issues relating to border management, I think the previous speaker has just mentioned, and so on and so forth. And of course, NTBs.
Exactly, NTBs, but as Dr. Mangeni said, there is a system for addressing those, and I guess the question still again comes back to how to use those, and if SMEs perhaps are set up to deal with them. I mean, one of the discussions yesterday, which George was summarising, was also about the degree to which the SCFTA itself can help address some of these problems. I mean, within the economies we're talking about, SMEs are perhaps subject to other constraints as well, to do sort of lack of access to credit, etc. So one of the questions then, I wanted to bring it back into the room with Professor Jaidi. If you're looking from a policy perspective, and we were thinking yesterday about the investment protocol, do you think, I mean, to what degree is that enough to help trigger these kinds of cross-border sort of market-seeking investments by small firms? And is there a need for some kind of additional instrument somehow for SMEs to help them sort of overcome some of the potential barriers they face?
Thank you. I think that the investment protocol is really a new step. And it is an important step in the process of encouraging investment in Africa and FDI general. And in this perspective, what is important now is to implementing this protocol and to guide all the rules that you find in this protocol, and to ratify it by all the states in Africa. And I think that the challenge is to stimulate investment through interconnected networks. Interconnected networks, namely the involvement of the private sector and the businesses in this dynamic supported by various financing and guarantee instruments. Because I think that the legal framework of the code is important, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough. We need more instruments and more institutions. And the most important instrument is the financing and guarantee for financing. And I think that Europe can play a very important role in this option, because the two partners, Africa and Europe, has expressed their intention to move from a logic of aid to African development, to a logic of investment on the continent. And this way is very, very important. So Africa's private sector needs financing to grow and gain independence from public funding. We have a very great necessity to develop a private guarantee of investment. But it also needs flexible facilities and regulations.
But do you see these as being specifically linked to the AfCFTA, or it's sort of SME finance anyway, regardless of trade and the continental
aspect? Because I think that in the strategy of the companies of the SMEs, we have an evidence is to access to a large market, continental market, strong or border markets in Africa. But we have the vision of many small enterprises are to access to European market or to Arab markets in the neighboring. So we can distinguish between what is the destination of the strategic products.
Yeah.
It is the logic of enterprise.
Absolutely.
But if you want to reinforce the links between the two partners, Europe and Africa, we have to imagine some instruments dedicated to improve the relation between the two countries. I think it is important.
I want to follow.
And I have some recommendation to present to the discussion.
Well, I'm going to come back on the Europe angle, but what I wanted to talk about was maybe also at the core of today's session is the inclusivity of SMEs. But at the same time, there are questions raised by Dr. Mangeni here as sort of a joint publication with Andrew Mould, I know, from UNECA, who stands by the idea that the SMEs cannot be the backbone of intercontinental trade or intracontinental trade, that it has to be large firms. And going back to the ambassador's speech this morning, in Europe, a lot actually depended on large firms who were the ones who were seeking to trade cross borders, and they had the capacity to do it.
Oh, okay.
I wonder how do you read the SME versus large firm discussion?
I agree with you that the landscape of the enterprise is not homogeneous. We have to assist even the champions, the African champions, to access in world market. They have more capabilities, yes, comparatively to the SMEs.
Yeah.
But when we talk about to enlarge the market, the African market, I think it is an opportunity for very small enterprise, African enterprise, or small economic and enterprise to access to this market.
Okay.
And it is the life of an enterprise is not confined to a moment of the creation or the beginning of its activity.
Yeah. So there's an evolution.
Enterprise. I think that large market is an opportunity for the small enterprise to have to acquire a large capacity in their vision and their access not only to national markets but to African and the international market.
I'm going to come back to you. I want to also just take a little bit that question back online to Dirk Willem de Velde, who leads the International Economic Group at ODI. Because what we just discussed there, in fact, if we're talking about SMEs, and we often think of SMEs working in trade in goods, but of course, there's a digital protocol being discussed. We mentioned the investment protocol, but there's also the trade and services protocol. Those are perhaps where SMEs are going to be sort of have more opportunities. How do you see that sort of element of these SMEs, large versus small? And therefore, what are the implications therefore for policymakers at the national and continental level, but also their partners? I mean, we're in an event where the EU is making sort of an offer, but there's sort of implications about how that offer gets channeled in the right way. Dirk Willem.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. I hope you can hear me. And it's a pleasure to be part of your event with the esteemed think tanks and contributors. Thank you very much. I suppose the question on small versus large, I've done a piece of work what's about now 10, 15 years ago, but I don't think I've shifted my thoughts on this very much, which is to say that if you're thinking about an economic policy, I don't think you necessarily need to distinguish between large and small. And so there are large firms, small firms, formal firms, informal firms, foreign firms, local firms. And I don't think you need to box them necessarily in like that. What you can do, however, is to think about what are the more productive firms and work with the productive firms. There are productive small firms and highly innovative, and there are large firms that are very productive as well. And there's some large firms that are not very productive, and you want to not really work with them, and they can be blockers. However, what I also mentioned, and I did that in the context of understanding different types of support programs. There was, for example, the World Bank UK that differed at that point, thinking about investment climate only support, and then the world will be fine. Versus, for example, the Japanese approach, which was one village, one product, and having very different types of assistance programs, and then realizing that different types of firms do require different types of support because they're also facing different constraints. And I think it's been highlighted also by the private sector speakers already. So particularly the smaller firms, well, there's access to finance. They are much more constrained than larger firms. Large firms may want to have large-scale electricity access, for example. Small firms also lack information much more so than larger firms, and they lack the connections. And I think that's why, for example, and we're working also with the Secretariat and others on the AfCFTA to support AfCFTA. And I think the guided trade initiative is so important there, because the guided trade initiative isn't just about reducing trade barriers; it's also about making connections. And I think Francis Mageni had an excellent speech, I think, excellent points there, where he also highlighted that, yes, there are many protocols, they all have a bearing, but there are also the instruments, additional instruments that can be important. And so the guided trade initiative about matchmaking, trying to think how a small women-led SME can export goods under the guided trade initiative to Cameroon, for example, is very interesting, and also to Ghana, for example. So making those matches are really important. And so that's I think is seems to be important. And with AfCFTA, I know. Okay, let me just finalize that. I think there are many entry points for the EU. So
yes, exactly. Where does the EU fit? If we're talking FDI linkages, is there a way to make that happen, sort of, which is concrete, or is also sort of depends very much by sector, by country? So it has to be very sort of sui generis per case.
Well, so it differs by sector, definitely, and different sectors are important. And we're working with the World Economic Forum Africa, for example, on how the private sector can work with AfCFTA Secretariat around a private sector implementation plan. And you can see that certain sectors are much more advanced in regional and continental positions, such as the automotive sector compared to, say, the pharmaceutical industry. So that's different. And if you think about linkages, and I think that's the one addition I would make to Francis, I think he mentioned negotiation, domestication, compliance, utilization. I would also say you need to have complementary policies in place as well. Linkage building is really important. And so it is all about how you use the firms that you attract. So if you have an investment protocol that attracts firms, or if you do investment promotion activities, then if it remains an enclave investment, it doesn't have the effects on economic transformation that you'd like to see. You also want to have linkage policies in place that can make sure that there is good quality supplies at the right time, and linkages between the larger firms and the smaller firms, and that you build up that. So I think linkages programs are really important there.
Yeah, no, but I think that's very useful, because I was also just thinking about yesterday when we talked about the investment protocol. One of the novelties in the investment protocol has been this idea of actually trying to define good investment in a way that has to be sustainable, that has to be contributing to wider value addition. But it also sort of brings to mind a sense that perhaps in many ways, there's a balance in a way between the AfCFTA as a trade agreement and the AfCFTA as a kind of political package, which is a bit sort of the message going beyond the economic narrow interpretation to something which is much wider. And in fact can be used as a sort of political hook in a way to create momentum around just promoting SME participation in the economy and trade within the REC and beyond to the AfCFTA. But one of the specific ambitions of the AfCFTA agreement, so it's written sort of in the text, is promoting industrialization and this idea of regional value chains. And one of the points that George raised from our discussion yesterday was that how this makes sense on paper, but there's always a sense of competition versus cooperation. So we can say that we want to have a battery value chain that includes the DRC minerals and includes inputs from Zambia. Then we could have processing elsewhere, feed them into the car sector, the automobile sector in Morocco or in South Africa. But when we're talking about, so that requires coordination, but ultimately those selling their resources go to the highest bidder. To what degree from the private sector side do you see, beyond sort of just looking for the best market, do you see an interest in trying to create these regional value chains? Does it take some kind of platform at a continental level to bring firms together? Or you think these regional value chains could happen sort of with more information, as you said, perhaps some sort of other support? Would that be enough? Or how do you, on the regional value chain side, I mean, it's going an extra step almost, but it's one of the ambitions which was stated.
Yes, it gets to the part where it can be complex and simple at the same time, right? Because on one end, they need to be aware about what do we mean by the regional value chains. Mark you, by the way, this is not like a new terminology. It's just been happening. It's just not been formalized. It's always been happening between different countries. Like you can look at the share, cacao, value chains and the likes. And I liked the fact that it was brought up not to think just in terms of goods, but also look at in terms of services. So one thing that has been pushed, and I saw what Professor Mageni who brought up with regards to the protocol of movement of people. You need people to move to be able to trade and to invest. Otherwise, you'll just be selling them an idea of Ethiopia, but unless they're here and interact with the local community, get to have an understanding of what it means to even make a business deal, understand the policy framework, it's going to be very difficult for them to invest into that country. So in our part, we are trying to do B2Bs, targeting like the Africa market. We are starting our first one with Algeria. Since in the Intra-Africa Trade Fair that just happened, Algeria is slotted as the next host for the Intra-Africa Trade Fair. So we wanted to look at pharmaceuticals and textiles and call other businesses within the African region who would be interested to go there. And now this is where the support is needed. So once they get to Algeria, who are they meeting, right? How do they get, if they get like a deal, who's going to support them with logistics, who's going to support them with contracts? Things like contracts also, by the way, are taken to be very, minuscule for those who are able to understand it. But to business people, they want to know what does it imply as a contract in one jurisdiction to a contract in another jurisdiction. So those kind of information, and then you bring them together as sectors, as you said. If you're able to hold those platforms that you bring together, everyone on share. Let's talk about share. How do we start to value share? Because most times you only have 3 categories of it. It's the unprocessed, medium processed, and fine. But is that the same terminology across the board? So there is the aspect of, one, bringing the sectors together, looking at where can we source this information, because that information is being provided with country snapshots, like by the Secretariat. Even ourselves, we have a country snapshot. Then through that outline, they look at an ecosystem approach, where they don't just look at it as we are the sector in coffee, and this is what we want to do. They have to look at the regulators being on board, the policymakers, the distributors, the logistics, all of them have to be in the same meeting. Another thing that we found is the fragmentation of ideas or, let's say, programs. And that is the other challenge that the AfCFTA is being faced. I'm calling it confusion by diffusion. We have too many different initiatives coming on board, but they're not interconnected. If you're building a space station, we all have to know from the bolt all the way to the main console. And then you designate who's working on that bolt, because they have that capacity, and who's working on the console, and regularly checking up on each other with M&E's factors, so that we see, okay, by us pipelining the cacao industry to connect to tourism, to connect to logistics, this is how everybody is coming on board. And then investment will follow, because at the end of the day, now people will see, made in Africa product is something I can buy. That's also another thing on mindset. Do we buy made in Africa products, even as the African market? So there has to be a mindset change within the market itself, but also in the approach that we have when it comes to sectors, not looking at it from all of us in one silo approach, but looking at the whole ecosystem and who needs to be involved.
Okay, very interesting. I'm actually just going to pass to Professor as well. I mean, I know that much of your work goes beyond Morocco, but I'm interested from a Moroccan perspective. We already heard from the ambassador about efforts that are underway to promote regional industrial platforms. Can you go into a little bit more about the same question about how interested are firms in exploring regional value chains across Africa? OCP, she mentioned the phosphate countries is a special case, I think. But in other sectors, is there a sort of openness and attempts to engage in these regional value chains?
Yes, there is a dynamic. And I think that the expansion of Moroccan enterprise in Africa is the result of the opportunities that Moroccan companies see. There are small enterprises.
Yeah.
Moroccan small enterprise in some industrial sectors, but there are various factors underlying the development of the Moroccan companies in Africa.
Yeah.
There are the institutional framework, the strategic industrial policy of Morocco and incentives.
And is that now geared around the AfCFTA? Is the national industrial policy now sort of taking the AfCFTA as a clear priority?
Yes, it is a real challenge, I think. And because it is a market potential.
Yeah.
This market potential and accessibility to this market potential, as well as development of investment of small enterprise, Moroccan small enterprise in Africa. I think that political system, stability of Morocco, and the strategic orientation in all the manufacturing sectorial and industry, textile and automobile.
So in fact, it's a lot of national factors which are shaping it.
It is the base for an expansion outside of the national market.
Yeah.
And this geographic expansion of Morocco companies begin first in West Africa, and that opens up to other regions in the continent.
Yeah.
And the establishment of Moroccan companies in Africa follows an incremental development.
So there's experience already, in a way, without a free trade area of Moroccan firms managing to enter into other African markets that can already be built upon, I guess, is the...
Yes, there is a macro vision.
Yeah.
And some instruments to accompany the quality of enterprise, but there is a risk.
Yeah. No.
The risk is supported by financial system or by assurance system.
Yeah.
And I think that the presence of the Moroccan bank in some countries in Africa helps to have a possibility to link this in Moroccan SMEs enterprise with other companies, African companies, local.
So this becomes an interesting point also, going back to what Dirk said, I think, about the interaction and interlinkages, but it requires these accompanying sort of background things. You said before...
What is important is not to have only a vision of access to markets.
Yeah, okay.
But to create a partnership with other enterprises. It is the guarantee for the validity of the relation.
Yeah.
Because the access to market will change
exactly
cost or price or other direction. But when you find your collaboration on the relations and their capital enterprise between 2 or 3 countries, I think it is there.
So there is a possibility. We started slightly late, so I'm going to ask for your indulgence to continue a little bit over time and also to get some questions here from in the room. I see online there's been some sort of ongoing discussion. If there are any specific questions that people want to put to the panelists around what's been said in terms of these ambitions and sort of the practical side, I think what we just heard from the Moroccan case is interesting because it sort of suggests that the national structures are the ones that are actually supporting the ability of Moroccan firms to go beyond the national market. We also heard sort of multiple times the issue of information. So there's obviously a job to be done in terms of sort of sharing information. But part of the discussion here is also about what's the potential supporting role of international partners. Is there anybody who wants to raise a question here? Yes, please. Do we have a microphone? I thought there was going to be somebody helping doing that, but yeah. Ah oui, on peut présenter les questions en français si on veut.
Oui, je veux parler en français parce que mon anglais n'est pas bon. Je suppose que...
Je vais traduire petit à petit. Brèvement.
Je voudrais tout simplement remercier tous ceux qui ont présenté et remercier également les panélistes pour soulever un point de concret. Nous devons quitter l'aspect théorique des choses. Aujourd'hui, la ZDK s'étudie. Le secrétariat a été mis en place et les actions sont en place. Je félicite le rôle de la Chambre de commerce, je crois que c'était ça, et qui aide aussi les partenaires des entreprises. Et pour ce reste de choses comme commentaire, pour ajouter dans le débat, moi je vois la collaboration, Madame l'ambassadeur a soutenu, la collaboration entre États africains pour être dans le cadre de l'espace de chaîne de valeur. Il y a eu je crois, c'était cette année où le Maroc a présenté ce qu'il peut apporter, ce que en tout cas, le peut apporter, n'est-ce pas, dans cette dynamique commerciale. Et l'aspect de phosphate, je pense, pour aider les pays africains dans l'agriculture. Vous savez que l'élément important aujourd'hui, c'est l'agriculture, pas dans tous les Et effectivement, dans ce cadre aussi des chaînes de valeur, ce qui se passe entre RDC et la santé dans la création, n'est-ce pas, des batteries pour les automobiles électriques. Ça, c'est concret dans les chaînes de valeur. Je vais rapidement dans un troisième point sur l'initiative du commerce guidé que le secrétariat a mise en place, l'initiative du commerce guidé. C'est un cadre dans lequel un certain nombre d'entreprises et un certain nombre de pays sont mis d'accord pour commencer déjà les échanges. On a mis en place l'accord, les partenaires nous attendent, les entreprises privées nous attendent, les acteurs privés globalement. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Est-ce qu'on rentre toujours dans les cas de théorie de parler des accords? Il faut quelque chose de concret. Donc, l'initiative du commerce guidé est arrivée au point, à point nommé, parce que là-dedans, on a déjà recensé un certain nombre de pays qui font partie de cette initiative, pays qui vont faire l'objet des échanges dans le cadre de catégorie A, catégorie B, tout ça. Je ne veux pas rentrer dans le temps. Il y a déjà une dynamique pour intégrer un certain nombre d'entreprises.
I'm going to ask you to be brief. Vous pouvez terminer un peu l'intervention.
Si vous voulez traduire.
Vous avez terminé? Oui.
Oui, il me reste peut-être 3 secondes.
Ok, mais très concret.
Je conclue rapidement pour dire que le secrétariat fait beaucoup de choses. Parce qu'il faut laisser la théorie. Nous avons par exemple les partenariats. AfCFTA et le secrétariat dans l'ajustement, disons dans les pertes de revenus. Vous savez très bien que la ZDK a fait peur aux pays africains de perdre des revenus. Donc AfCFTA est à côté pour faire en sorte qu'il y ait quand même un fonds d'ajustement de perte de revenus. Ça, c'est concret. Et nous avons la question des zones économiques spéciales. Vous le savez très bien. Vous savez que la base de nos industries, disons dans les pays du Sahel, c'est dans ces zones économiques. Même le Maroc, je crois que le Maroc aussi est dans ce cadre-là. C'est tout un espace où on retrouve plusieurs entreprises. Le problème, c'est que la ZDK, avec ses aides, posait un problème de concurrence.
Tout à fait. Donc ça, c'est
donc, cette question a été réglée en Nairobi. Je coupe rapidement pour dire qu'il y a eu un règlement qui a été fait là-dessus. Et pour finir, il y en a beaucoup, je vais
résumer, vraiment très résumé. So, just to very briefly sum up.
Ce qu'on fait, parce qu'il faut laisser la théorie. Je veux dire qu'il faut laisser un peu le débat théorique. Aujourd'hui, le monsieur va parler de l'automobile. Le prochain round de négociation sur l'automobile et textile. Je crois que c'est un élément de négociation assez concret. Merci beaucoup.
Well, maybe I could pose that to the panelists online then, and I can just briefly translate. The main point was there's a need now to go from the theory to reality, and in fact, the CFTA is a reality. That African states are trading under the Guided Trade Initiative, and he mentioned the fact of sort of the need for countries like Morocco to Gabon, sort of made an offer in a way, came and presented this is what sort of Morocco can do. And I think this is what we see, and that was what was mentioned also in the DRC, Zambia cooperation discussion around batteries. But then what you said at the end was also around SEZs. I mean, so there are other initiatives taking place, and special economic zones has been one of the other areas which we've not touched on today, which caused some difficulties in terms of how they should be treated within the AfCFTA, but also remain sort of a core tool, let's say, for promoting industrialization and investment. But since Dirk, I was supposed to come back to you also just to pick up a little bit on the sort of the EU role in FDI, but maybe this issue of special economic zones as well. If those are a priority for certain countries, are you able to sort of talk a little bit about how those could be used to overcome some of the challenges that we've mentioned today about linking FDI with SMEs within certain countries?
Okay, thank you. I couldn't hear all the contributions, but there's a couple of questions around moving to practical implementation, I think, as well, and how to work with the private sector, how the private sector can work with policymakers to really go to the implementation stage and to think about what is needed to make it all work and to solve problems. And I think here, the coming year we need to see, and we're also working with the Secretariat on that, on a work program on National Implementation Committee. So I think there needs to be institutionalization of implementation, and these are particularly around coordinating actions. And so the front runners was, for example, Ghana set one up, and these are, of course, good instruments to also work with the private sector to think about what are the problems out there, what is it that you can do to enhance the impact of the AfCFTA, what can you do to promote the sort of information about the AfCFTA, and I think that's where we need to move towards. And I think that the TAF was mentioned already, so the TAF is an EU instrument that can of course help with that as well, to help oil the wheels of implementation at country level, and where the AfCFTA Secretariat can help to coordinate this and to share best practices. I think the other question that came up in this now, Bruce, that you mentioned was about the maybe winners and losers, or you collaborate, you compete, and so on. I think it's just in any trade agreement is there will be winners and losers, and there's an importance of comparative advantage and competitive advantages, and they're slightly different. So those countries have a competitive advantage may gain and so on. But I think also, and perhaps that's where the EU has some where you can learn. And I think the ambassador spoke at length about that. But there was two issues there. One was that it takes time. So I'm sure the EU would give implementers of its support programs time to get the results as well. But the other is about social cohesion. And I think that's always been a theme within Europe. Is that there may be laggard countries and faster countries. It's not always the case. Peripheral countries may also gain, like Ireland and so on. But what we find in integration studies is that the larger countries, the large integrated, connected countries gain more from integration on the whole than others. So there's an adjustment fund that is being put in place, and I think that is something that has been sort of initially capitalized by the African Bank, as I understand. But I think there could be much more. Finance could go in there, and I think this is something for the EIB, the European Investment Bank, which invest in large tickets, to really go behind that and to say. The adjustment fund, we understand that there may be losers and gainers at country level and also across countries. So you can actually vary that, and you can say, well, actually, let's use this to guide and help to help implement the AfCFTA and understand that there may be winners and losers, and that this adjustment fund can really help the losers come up, and so that may be another instrument that the EU could support actively. There are a range of others. I think EU FDI as well. So I think global value chains, regional value change would be important for competitiveness, and I think it would also help to perhaps attract EU FDI as well. And I think there should be more active promotion from EU FDI into Africa, both ways. And I think that is, I facilitate a couple of UK African countries investor forum. I was this week with the Minister of Finance from Somalia, for example, at ODI. But there are many more, and I think EU could do something like that as well. The matchmaking, I think, and just to see where to have some active promotion events as well, and then African countries can see how EU FDI can fit in to help them with their objectives, such as industrial development and building regional value chains.
Well, that's very useful, and I mean, we know that around the summits often is a Europe-Africa Business Forum. So I think there are attempts to do that, and PASI is actually possibly involved also in some Europe-Africa business connections. Do you want to say something about that, actually, and how successful those are, or what some of the challenges are of making that connection between sort of the European firms and local firms?
Yes.
Yeah, you can have that one.
So we do have a partnership with the European Entrepreneurs, where we were creating a platform to link SMEs in Africa and SMEs in Europe. Because again, they would not know who to rely on, which information to get to. So our work, again, going through the chamber, you have the businesses already vetted, they're already verified. So when they get onto the platform, they can easily be able to do the B2B that they want to do with them. And also being part of the EU Africa Business Forum, it was quite interesting when we had the different groups, the working groups in the different sectors. So we had one on agro, another on energy and the likes. The key message that came out was the follow-up. The issue was the follow-up. The discussions were, honestly, the outputs were good. There were good leads that were given from the African perspective, from the European perspective, but the question was who's following up with the implementation of it before we get to the next one. So it's that question of how do we, even us as the Pan-African Chamber, take some of those inputs to be able to correlate the partnerships, again, through the national chambers that we work with, to get both markets access.
And what would need to happen for that follow-up? I mean, is that a question of funding to allow other sort of sector-specific meetings, or it's what kind of activity would allow that follow-up? Or is it a national level thing, actually, where we have investment promotion agencies who need to kind of follow up with firms?
The thing is, it would be the same way we had the groups, where you had organizations with similar interests on those topics. We were working together already on it. So it would be to design the framework of implementation, because this was the framework of designing what would be the EU Africa Business Forum, what would be the key outputs. But then after that, you know, if you don't give somebody responsibility, they just...
Yeah, no, exactly.
Right? So it would be to call back to those groups and then bring back again what is going to be the framework of implementation. And then have that as, this was what we did in 2022, what are we doing in the next one in 2024? So that there's a level of continuity, because we were there in the previous one, and then the next one, there still was the same discussion. You couldn't see quite a lot of traction. Yes, there were a couple of deals that were made that were progressive. Now it is about how do we make sure that there's a level of sustainability in this type of interaction.
I mean, Dr. Mangeni also mentioned the intra-Africa trade fairs, and I guess those play a role for the intra side, and I guess there's a question of having the continuity with European firms. Are there any more? We're going to wrap up soon, but I'd like to take any questions. Let's take 2 or 3 in the room here. Sorry, ladies first, I just said. Yeah. We'll come to you next. No. Now the microphone's there, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Stefan Asset. I'm from the Swedish Mission Gladys. I'll try to be very swift. If we look back in history very shortly and briefly, UNCTAD lists that actually world trade have decreased during the past 50 years. Because there have been ups and downs, but basically trade for Africa have decreased as a proportion of the total trade we have in the world. That can be challenged, of course, and specifically during different periods. And also, if we look at direct investments in Africa, that has not sort of reached the level where it should be if you look at the potential of Africa, really. The only thing we haven't really touched upon properly today is what actually the professor alluded to some extent, is actually governing the market. Nations' responsibility to create an atmosphere which are conducive to businesses, both local businesses and international businesses. So I a little bit have a difficulty when we speak about helping companies, because companies that are conducive and competitive will not need more help than actually an environment that is conducive to business. So in that sense, I would like to hear more on what we can do now, and in particular what governments in Africa can do more now to actually ensure that there is a conducive business environment.
Okay, very good. Because that's one of the points that came up yesterday around the investment protocol, is that creates a framework. It potentially harmonizes sort of the investment regulations, but of course, underlying that then is the specificities of the local economy. Yes, please, madam.
Hello, my name is Katrina from the Australian Embassy. I was pleased to hear the EU ambassador earlier speak about inclusivity in a more broader and macro sense. And I would like to hear a little bit more about the panelists, because obviously including SMEs is so critical in including women, and particularly women-owned businesses. To that effect, I'd like to know how much there is a look, perhaps, and this is controversial in an EU-sponsored event, but beyond the EU to structures that may be supported. For example, Australia has joined New Zealand, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, New Zealand and Peru in the Inclusive Trade Action Group, which very specifically ensures that any trade deal we're involved in ensures that trade agreements protect the environment, combat climate change, promote gender equality, secure labour rights, and support our First Nations peoples. And I'm sure that there's some fantastic opportunities to cooperate as the EU moves towards this free trade agreement. And so just, I guess, an encouragement to look at some global structures where there might be opportunities for cooperation as well. Thank you.
And is that Inclusive Trade Action Group through the WTO, or it's outside WTO? Yeah.
All WTO members.
Okay, so that's but indeed, again, in the investment protocol, some of these issues that you just mentioned are there. So, and I guess the question is sort of, perhaps states can sign up to these things, and the SCFTA cannot be the basket for everything, but it's a good point to add. Yes, please, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Frank Mwega from Tanzania Embassy. Yeah, one thing I would like to raise, which is very important to African countries, is how can we engage to these SMEs in order to capture the market. If it's the role of our government to promote agriculture, to promote production, and the role of international partners for support. But in this there is a fair play within the international community to accept the production from African countries to penetrate to the different market. We are talking about here AfCFTA, yes, but through that is also a fair game to penetrate within us and to penetrate with outside. Okay. So if we can address that, we can help these SMEs also to grow.
Are you thinking of something in particular? Are you thinking of standards? Or are you thinking of?
There's a lot of issues.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the macro level.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, did I see another hand? Okay, we've got two more. And then apparently we have permission to continue until 4:30. I understand that some of the participants have to drop out. But if not, we'll close it in 15 minutes. So yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Erkala from Policy Studies Institute. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My reflection is one a suggestion, the other is a question. With regard to AfCFTA, less is being practiced in terms of making policy studies and be able to help the government revise policies and strategies. So, as a substitute, we're just observing less cooperation in making related to policy studies and be able to present evidences for policymakers. So, from that respect, what effort is being made from your side? And the other is the private sector, as you know, in Ethiopia is less engaged either in development or value chains because of access to finance, which remains one of the biggest bottleneck. Is it part of this is part of your efforts so that the private sector is able to have a good, sustainable access to finance so that the FTA is going to be scaled up. That's my question.
Very good. Okay, thanks. So that's 2 points. One about the policy analysis that Dr. Mangeni was actually asking for at the beginning and saying was necessary, and also then on the access to finance and the degree to which that can accompany maybe the AfCFTA implementation, right? And then I'm going to go back to our panelists for one sort of last response to this and also to the overall question. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Andy Lamb. I'm from UNDP Regional Service Centre in Africa, based here in Addis, so not the country office, just to be clear. I wanted to sort of bring in the business and human rights angle slightly, partly as an information sharing exercise, because the business and human rights environment in Africa has already been doing quite a lot of work on this. For example, about 6 months ago, there was a forum here for all the national human rights institutions, specifically to get them engaged on this treaty and to help them, free trade agreement, and to help them understand how it will impact. And then, of course, at a national level, a lot of the countries now on the continent are doing national action plans, which are multi-stakeholder initiatives, which do include bodies, that do include SME sort of enterprises as well. And it's a way in a forum where some more of this information can be shared. And then that sort of also relates to the B2B sort of information sharing that can be really useful. As the EU's due diligence guidelines come online, there are also going to be a lot of activities about how companies at a national level can make sure that their supply chains are compliant with that. And this can also create a bit more of a commonality across different countries. And, you know, in a supply chain mentality, larger companies are going to be having to work directly with their smaller companies in their supply chains to make sure that comes into place. Yeah. So just as a way of recognizing that business and human rights is also very important in this discussion, but can be used, this conversation that's already happening at a continental level and at regional levels can be used as a way to increase the capacity and information flow to SMEs and the likes.
Okay, no, thank you very much. And I think that, in a way, or the way I interpret that, then sort of this linkage between the trade agreement and the business and human rights, and what you're saying about the supply chain thinking is indeed, if we think with the Europe connection, that's something which is going to be coming up in European legislation. But also, to me, it raises the point that the AfCFTA as an agreement can be used for, again, more than just trade and market access, that it's a tool for wider ambitions. I'm going to go back to our panelists now just to get some final remarks. I'm going to come to you first, Stephen, because I feel I gave you less time previously. But so please feel free to sort of respond to some of the things that you've heard here so far. And maybe a small question which you could add in there is around the role of the RECs in this whole AfCFTA. In terms of sort of, Dirk mentioned national implementing committees. Do you see a regional implementation committee type role for the regional bodies in here? So I'll give you just 2 minutes just to sort of pull some final thoughts together that could be useful for our takeaway from this.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce. Let me first highlight part of the studies we found also reflect on the differences between the countries. All the countries are developing what they call national implementation strategies for implementing the AfCFTA. When you look at them, they reflect the levels of their capacity for their SMEs to trade within the continent. Let me take an example. When you look at Malawi, the strategy's emphasis is on civic education for the private sector, promoting trade, but also a realization that they need to take full advantage of the existing opportunities they have under the RECs, FTAs, before they try to move beyond the region. Then when comparatively, when you look at the Mauritius strategy, the Mauritius strategy concentrates on what they call 3 things: information, promotion, and logistics, and look at how they can take advantage of, for instance, the EPZs that they are trying to establish to penetrate the market and use them for their value chain development for their SMEs. The Mauritian ones also look more at the infrastructure linkages. They indicate that they can quickly, rapidly create the space for SME production to feed into the value chains, but how will they be able to take advantage of the infrastructure linkages? Finally, on your question on the
But I was
RECs.
coming to the office and I was like, I'm gonna ask.
Somebody's got the microphone out there, needs to stop.
Yeah, finally on the RECs. Now, the RECs definitely are the backbone for the success of the AfCFTA. I said at the beginning, we concentrated on the RECs. FTA are key utilization in the success of the AfCFTA because the AfCFTA treaty specifically provided for that, and what they call unrelated related best practices of the REC. So that is the backbone for the success. Now, there are a few challenges, institutional challenges that you can see, which will bring problems for the RECs. While the trade can continue between the RECs argue that they do not participate at AfCFTA level in the negotiations as a party. They are observers. So they are seeking ways in which they can elevate their participation. So those are some of the challenges. And they feel that there is need for greater interaction between them and the AfCFTA Secretariat in addressing some of these opportunities we are talking about, for instance, for the SMEs being able to get regional value chains and so on. So I hope that summarizes.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to summarize just everybody when we get to the end. Dirk, do you want to pull sort of some of your thoughts together from all this just in a few sentences?
Okay. I think your point about AfCFTA being more than just a trade agreement is important here. Just narrow tariff liberalization can produce gains, but they're much larger if there's other things happening at the same time. And the evidence does suggest that there's also complementary infrastructure and a range of other areas. The study we did we surveyed companies in Kenya about AfCFTA about 1 or 2 years ago with the KNCCI. Basically, the survey said that there was not much knowledge of the AfCFTA, but those that did say something, they said that hoped that it would lead to better public-private dialogue, and I think that's one issue. Secondly, there was an issue around inclusive trade and it helping female traders, and I think that as part of the AfCFTA implementation, you need to think about trade facilitation and trade-related infrastructure. And I know that the EU is also supporting that, for example, through Trademark Africa. And some of those border crossings are really helping women disproportionately. So that's really useful and very important. And I think that needs to be enhanced, and even more can be enhanced because certain sectors are more intensive of female laborers, female workers, and so a complementary action there would be even better. So there's already trade-related infrastructure that might be relevant, but even you can complement it with other targeted action. And then there was a gentleman who was asking around what more can be done. And I think here, I also hope that AfCFTA leads to those sort of questions. It basically, we have now market access, i.e. we now need to think about domestic supply capacity to export and some similar type of questions. So that then leads to more targeted intervention. And I would say generally about supporting economic transformation, because I think the AfCFTA is an instrument that can help the EU 2063 agenda of economic transformation, is that this is an investment climate plus agenda. It isn't the case that if you just have the investment climate right, i.e. the business rules are right, that then suddenly investment will come and economic activity will come. That's not the evidence that we get from other countries that have transformed. There's also complementary action. It needs a political environment that is right, but for targeted interventions that can, that are country specific, and then you need to listen to the concerns that are there. The coordination phase that need to be addressed, and I would say also for development partners is then support that process of targeted interventions at country level to complement business environment rules, AfCFTA rules, etc. And so if you think about bringing those elements together at country level, I think then you can get a long way into making a step change in economic transformation, productivity change, inclusive employment generation that is beneficial for the whole population, including women and youth.
Great, thanks. Okay, so flagging a couple of initiatives that are already underway, then sort of Trademark Africa, many people will know here who are engaged in facilitating trade. But your last point was really about sort of the importance of the domestic level, which goes back to what Professor Jaidi was saying also about, yes, it's around sort of these protocols and the wider structures, but ultimately it's about the kind of almost the support mechanisms taking place within the countries. I'm going to pass the words to Ween-Kate. Final words responding to this and your take sort of from the Chamber's type perspective, a private sector perspective, and then I go to Professor Jaidi, and we'll have wrapped up from Thomas Bergerbarth afterwards.
Right. Okay, so
working?
I'm not sure if they can hear me on this one.
You're fine.
Great. All right. So just to more or less put together everything that has been brought up in the discussions, one thing that I brought up when we were doing Africa Trade Fair, the word SME as one grouping tends to be also limiting. And this is because we met with different groups. So there needs to be design around an S to an M to an E as a journey, particularly with chambers of commerce. Because if you think about it, one of our programs that we did on empowering marginal economic actors through policy reform from the bottom up, such a mouthful, that was, we had the study on one arm done on who are we calling as marginal economic actors. Then the second pillar was looking at how do you capacitate the associations to come up with interesting services that could cater to them, so that they could feel that, yes, we can formalize and feel that there is at least a body representing us. Some of them went to propose things like samples for the women to get access to finance as a way to be established as the savings and credit cooperatives. And then the other bit of the other pillar is where we did the PPD together with the National Chamber. So we took all the information from the last two pillars and built up on a policy discussion in Ethiopia and eventually having capacity development of it. So there's always that ecosystem approach when it comes to tackling the issues for the private sector. So it's not always just to say the SME, but to break it down and to see how we pipeline that for them, and even to larger funds. So when we're communicating the AfCFTA, it's clear based on the different stages, how are they actually engaged and supported. Yeah. On the part of localizing the AfCFTA, I believe there was a mention on the Africa Private Sector Summit and what they proposed in the Charter on the Charter for an Enabling Business Environment, which they took from the protocols already existing within the AfCFTA, but adding the word right, so that the businesses feel again that there is now that commitment. It's not just an agreement, but there is a commitment by the political arm. And on our end, seeing how do we again bridge with academia. We have an Africa Education Trust Fund that's been put together with the idea of the academia-industry linkage, particularly making R&D accessible, again, for SMEs. And if you're talking about regionalities, it's more important to have that R&D. So universities already start studying the local climate and therefore can be able to give innovations that we can utilize. So all in all, there are different initiatives on board. I am just putting it as a call for all different parties working on the AfCFTA. The AfCFTA Secretariat has amazing tools that they have put out, information studies. The question is, how do we come together and start building our spaceship and know where exactly each one of us is going to work best? As Chambers of Commerce, we are technically the conduit. We bring together all the businesses. So if you're talking about capacity development, you're talking about finance, if you're talking about market intelligence, we should primarily focus on how we capacitate those chambers in order to now bring down what we're trying to get. Most of the times when here with FDIs, we say they can't reach direct to the SME. But what if we had a circle that's a part of an association that then can be able to do so? So these are some of the innovative thinkings and out. And I would wish that we had a call with experts from the different organizations, like as a program manager, so that then we look at how many programs, each one of us, what programs we have, what stage are we at, and then see how we can collaborate. Because at this stage, honestly, it's about collaboration if you want the AfCFTA to really work in the information that we disseminate down.
Very good. That's a nice final word to finish off. And then Professor Jaidi. So collaboration, ecosystems, R&D, and how to build the spaceship. I like it. The moonshot.
I think that I can present some recommendations for the future for our research as a think tank. And I think that the business environment in African countries is in uncertainty. Uncertainty. It is the main cause for the difficulties of SMEs and other enterprises, because it is the origin of additional costs and overestimation of economic risk in Africa. So I think that it could be useful in this context to develop and institutionalize chamber of commerce and industry in all African countries. But we have to be clear that the chamber have a great role, a great responsibility in facilitating dialogue between businesses and disseminating information on financing, on technology, or other questions in a clear manner. And I think that the possibility for a creation of an arbitration chamber, an African arbitration chamber, is also a great challenge, and it is a necessity to deal with difficulties, to deal with conflicts between firms, African firms, or the conflict between African firms, African enterprise, and other enterprise in the world. I think that EU can also play an important role in improving this business climate by developing the technical assistance policy, which is, in my opinion, preferred to budget support. And the establishment of an ecosystem of guarantee in Africa is another challenge, because we have a landscape with many funds, many institutions, but there is no dialogue between these institutions on their mechanism, on their capacity to collaborate together in this guarantee. And I think that setting up what we name one-stop shops can reduce these inegalities in access to finance for SMEs or other enterprise, to access to donor funding, etc. And the last idea, I think, important for the business climate is to involve the private sector in policy dialogue. The private sector in Africa is not really autonomous. It has not professional organization, strong professional organization, and capacity to dialogue with the states and with other parties. I think to this point of to involve the private sector policy in policy dialogue is very very important. And the last one is to create a platform between public and private sector.
Exactly.
Notably in financing infrastructure.
Okay. Yeah, no, we haven't touched so much on that. But I think, you see, you're going back to the good sort of underlying thing here is sort of this coordination. I mean, one of the questions that sort of comes to my mind then is sort of next steps after this. And for us as policy think tanks, we're going to have to close off. We can discuss afterwards informally. But as the think tanks, we're going to pull together sort of some of the main points from this and put it in a policy brief that we'll be happy to share. And also, if there are sort of follow-up suggestions or things to add by email, you can use the same address for registration. But from my side, thank you very much. I just want to pass the final word to Thomas Heigebach, who's going to summarize everything that's been said here today in a very succinct form, just for 2 minutes, and then we relieve everybody.
Yeah. No, I think indeed there are some drinks and snacks waiting for you. This has been a lively afternoon, I think, with a lot of extremely good inputs. I mean, we all know that the CFTA is creating a momentum for a number of very important changes that are to happen on the continent. I think today we heard the importance of politics, policy, and practitioners. I don't know if it. Yeah, it works. It works. Of course, we can only move if everyone does his and her part. I think what we heard today was the importance of implementation. I think this is the year of the CFTA implementation. It's the first real year where things are really starting. So it is very normal that you take time to move on your framework, on your toolbox. And I think we're almost there with the toolbox completely. I think at the next EU summit in February, the remaining tools should be eventually adopted. But of course, what we need is to show and illustrate that trade is happening under that framework, and that step by step we see the results of this. I think from the Moroccan intervention of the ambassador, we heard a number of concrete illustrations of their engagement to actually very concretely contribute to the CFTA. And I think what we heard is, of course, that the CFTA is only a framework. What we need is also all kinds of things around. It's investments, it's transformation, and I think that's where a lot of things are starting to happen, but where a lot more is needed. We also, of course, heard that the importance of awareness raising is that you said it in the streets here in Addis. I think there is not many people who are at all aware of the CFTA. I mean, not necessarily that everyone needs to be immediately aware, but those who are doing business, who are creating small and medium enterprises need to know about the opportunities and this framework, but also the same on the customs offices, the tax offices, and all actors that are important in this. We've heard, of course, that at the heart of all this is the private sector, the small and the big with different needs. And I think we will look forward to the specific recommendations coming from this. From the EU side, I think, well, we are trying, and we know that we are definitely not perfect, but to have an integrated 360 approach, which means, I mean, from the early days on, we've been there to accompany the making of the toolbox with our EU technical assistance facility, where 7 member states are joining forces. We are helping and working hand in hand with the CFTA Secretariat, but also now at this stage able to support specific needs of EU member states, RECs, and also business associations, where soon the first call of proposal that we have will announce the results of those. But beyond that, I think with our global gateway, we are trying to work on the important connections that were said, both on the digital front. So it's sometimes just having more broadband cables between countries so that digital opportunities increase. Of course, there's the importance of energy, which is like if still 600 million people on the continent are not connected. So a lot of investment on renewable and transmission lines are happening. So all this is part of the aim of creating intra-African connections, because I think in the past too much of the connections were made towards exporting. But I think for the EU, biggest interest is to see that Africa does more business with Africa. And then we will have eventually even more opportunities for the EU. Lastly, just to finish, of course, this is our third event with African and European think tanks. We have the core ones and that have been engaged from the start. But at each event, we are establishing new networks with new actors. And I think this is important for policy actors from the EU side and the EU side. And so we really hope to further build. I would like to finish with thanking a lot the Embassy of Morocco and the ambassador for co-organizing this, co-hosting it. Of course, with the policy center of the New Sound, who was taking the lead for this specific event, but also, of course, all the other think tanks. I think it's also for Europe and Africa, it's important to have this people-to-people connections. And I think we want to do even more on this front. And this is just a little one. And just thank you all participants for coming. Hope it was interesting. As was said, we will share, I mean, they will finalize the conclusions and main recommendations coming from those discussions. And this will be shared with all of you, but also in particular to the policymakers and so on, so to actively use them. Thank you very much. Let's go.